report, Keeping 1.5 Degrees Celsius Alive. In this headline event of the day, we'll be discussing what's needed from the UNCCC process, the COP26 outcome, and climate action over the coming years to respond to the IPCC sixth assessment report and keep that 1.5 degree goal within reach. The findings are unequivocal. Human-induced climate change is already affecting weather and climate extremes in every region of the globe. And unless we have deep cuts in CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions, global warming of 1.5 or 2 degrees will be exceeded this century. Now, we're going to shortly hear from the UK COP26 envoy, John Merton, and the COP Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, before a panel discussion with a lineup of diverse and expert speakers. But first, before we start, here's a video with a reminder of the Working Group 1 contribution to the IPCC sixth assessment report.
Good afternoon, everybody. I do apologize that instead of Alok Sharma himself, you have me, his envoy. But the COP president is now deeply involved in advancing the discussions towards an ambitious negotiated outcome to this COP that will resolve some of the problems that we've seen in the video. And it's a pleasure to be here to discuss the implications of the IPCC report for our goal of keeping 1.5 degrees alive. We all know that every fraction of a degree matters when it comes to our global temperature. At 2 degrees centigrade of global warming, there would be widespread and severe impacts on people and on nature. And at 1.5 degrees C, the impacts would be serious, but much less severe. At 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming, there would be lower risks of food and water shortages, lower risks to health, to economic growth, and fewer species at risk of extinction. And we know this because the science tells us so. Science can show us how to turn the tide against climate change as well, and to create a healthier, cleaner, and more prosperous future. But we do not have long. the IPCC has been clear that the situation is critical. Its Working Group 1 report was a wake-up call to the world. It has shown that if we do not act immediately, the 1.5 degree limit will slip out of our reach. Keeping 1.5 degrees C alive requires us to halve global emissions by 2030, to reach net zero by mid-century, and to transform every sector of our economy. We have made some progress towards that goal, including here at COP26 over the last week. 90% of the global economy is now covered by net zero targets, compared to less than 30% 2 years ago. We have all but ended international coal financing, thanks to commitments from the G7, the G20, South Korea, and China. And this week, we have taken a serious bite out of international public financing for fossil fuels more generally, with the US, Canada, and many others signing up to our declaration to end international public financing of fossil fuels, and we expect more news on that today. Over 100 countries, representing close to half of global methane emissions, have signed the Global Methane Pledge to limit global methane emissions by 30% by 2030. But, as today's Climate Action Tracker report will no doubt highlight, there is much further to go, particularly when it comes to nationally determined contributions. Science will be key to enabling us to move further and faster. We have emphasized the centrality of science throughout our COP presidency. We have sought to raise the voice of academics, including with our Global Science and Innovation Network. And we have reinforced the importance of inclusivity, which we know improves outcomes in research and climate action. And the Science and Innovation Day we're enjoying today continues that work. It places science at the heart of the conference. It includes events on Indigenous-led research and gender equality. And at this event, we will hear from experts on what is required from COP26 and from the international process over the coming years. So I urge governments and policymakers and negotiators, if there are any negotiators left in this room, although I suspect they are busy, occupied elsewhere, to listen carefully to what the scientists have to say. I urge them to translate the insights of our scientists into an ambitious COP26 outcome and a critical decade of action, and to allow the science, the evidence, and the experts to light our way on that journey. I was but a poor substitute for Alok Sharma, but it's my very great pleasure to hand over now to the real and actual COP26 Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. We are talking at this conference about the health of our planet. And the IPCC has been a most remarkable diagnostician. The climate scientists over many decades have picked up evidence of change, they've documented it, they've been clear about the trajectory, and they've been clear about this being man-made. The IPCC and Working Group 1 have made a remarkable report in the Sixth Assessment Report, and you've seen some of the outcomes. It's a report that is deeply based in science and technical expertise, bringing together the latest advances in climate science and, of course, combining multiple lines of evidence. I won't repeat the sobering findings of that report because you all know them. We know that climate change is widespread, rapid, and intensifying. We absolutely know that we need to stick to 1.5 if we are to halt the enormous changes we're seeing that could occur right the way around the world, extreme weather events and others. This target of 1.5 isn't fanciful, it isn't plucked from the air, it's an important evidence-based number, and it's a real possibility, albeit one that is going to require unprecedented change. The case for urgent action is beyond argument, and there are two things that we must do. The first is to reduce emissions rapidly and reach net zero as quickly as possible. And it's gratifying to see some of the things that have already been agreed at this conference. It's good to see that 90% of the global economy is now covered by net zero commitments, up from 30% not that long ago. It's good that there's a coalition to phase out coal power and end support for new coal power plants. Over 100 countries have pledged to lower global emissions of methane by 30% below 2020 levels by 2030. There's a declaration on ending deforestation by 2030. There were big commitments around innovation in agriculture. And of course, the Glasgow breakthroughs and the new innovation missions are particularly important, and I'll come back to that. The second thing that we must do is adapt to climate change. And I think to do one without the other is a big mistake. We have to adapt in order to be ready to cope with what's coming and to be ready to implement the mitigation changes. And I'm particularly pleased today to see the launch of the Adaptation Research Alliance, 90 organizations across 30 economies, all about trying to increase the resilience of vulnerable communities who are at the forefront of climate change. What we're seeing is pledges, and pledges need to turn into clear plans, and those plans need to bring actions. The stage is now when we need to turn these plans into detail. And we should heed, I think, the call of one of the Earthshot nominees, 15-year-old Venetia Umashankar, who said, "Stop talking and start doing." And that's what needs to happen. And those actions must be underpinned by science. We've got to integrate science and innovation into governments right the way across the world so that policymakers and leaders can understand uncertainties, and yes, there are many, many uncertainties, particularly as we think about solutions, priorities, risks, benefits, trade-offs, and synergies, and ultimately be better placed to make the right decisions. Giving policies a firm and transparent evidence base is an important part of persuading people that this transformational change is necessary and that the costs of inaction far outweigh the costs of action. Evidence-based policies, which are transparent, also convince people that changes are desirable, that tangible health benefits and economic benefits can come. And much of that evidence base, of course, comes from work of scientists across the globe. First, technical and innovation. We have many of the technologies needed to tackle the problem, but they need to be improved. There need to be iterative improvements. They need to come down in cost. They need to increase in convenience. They need to be applicable right the way across the globe, and we need to scale them. And scaling technologies requires research and development. It's one thing to make something work for 100 people. It's quite another to make it work for 100 million people. So scaling of these and implementation first. Linked to that, we haven't got all the things we need, and therefore we must continue to invest in research and development for new things for the future. Second point, through collaboration and challenge, and I'll emphasize that word challenge, we can agree standards for monitoring, and monitoring of what we are now seeing pledges for is going to be important. And that monitoring, I think, will need to include direct emission measurements. So we need to have better ways of monitoring. The third is that science will contribute the social sciences and behavioral sciences, because this isn't done as a purely technological thing. It's going to require multiple interventions from technologies to land use and others. And of course, we need to understand cultural, institutional, and knowledge barriers to that change. And finally, this is a systems problem. This requires systems thinking, systems engineering to think about how this integrates and how one thing links to another. So in short, strong relationships between policymakers and scientists and engineers are essential for developing effective, evidence-based roadmaps for transition. And that's why actually I was pleased earlier this week when the International Climate Council Network was launched with a call to world leaders to establish a climate council or equivalent structures of their own in every country, and I endorse that call. I think we must make sure that we've got science, engineering, and other disciplines feeding into governments. So what's the importance of science and innovation today? This is the Science and Innovation Day. Well, before this meeting, a group of science advisors from around the world, over 40, wrote a letter, open letter, to emphasize the crucial role of science and innovation. And I'd like to reiterate just 3 clear calls that were made from this group. 1, develop ambitious, scientific, evidence-based, long-term strategies, all of those words are important in that sentence, which demonstrate efforts to keep 1.5 alive as a target. That's the most critical thing. Second, increase international collaboration to accelerate the research and development, demonstration and deployment of effective mitigation and adaptation solutions. Some of those measures have been announced, the Mission Innovation Projects, the Adaptation Research Alliance, to name a couple. And this is also important, the third point, establish programs to strengthen global research and innovation capacity, because without that, countries across the world who have unequal opportunity around science and innovation will not be able to respond. So today, science and innovation is at the core of the COP26 agenda, but actually it's been at the core throughout the meeting. It's been core today as we've heard about health, we've heard about gender, we've seen items like the future we want, which looks at how we can thrive in a net zero future, realizing risk to raise climate ambition, to change the way we analyze and discuss climate risks, and as I've said, climate action for health, where many, many countries have now committed to a resilient health system in the face of climate change, and several have committed to net zero to their health systems. But let me come to an end of this by saying science isn't something off in one corner. It's not something that's called on when you need somebody in a white coat to come and help you. It's something that has to be woven through every consideration in our response to this global problem that we face. Science has played the role of the diagnostician, but actually, in planetary health, it now needs to play the role of the treatment as well. And the treatment will be all of those things, from technology, innovation, land, natural solutions, and behavioral and societal change that I've discussed. So science and innovation is providing the solution. It does need to be listened to. It is important that we have the structures, and it's very important that we learn on other global responses to make sure that science and innovation can help treat the planet as well as diagnose what we've seen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick Vallance, and also John Merton, for setting the scene for our panel discussion and emphasizing the urgent need to follow the science. Well, I'm going to invite our panelists to take their seats, so please welcome Henry Puna, Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum and former Prime Minister of the Cook Islands, Gonzalo Munoz, UN High-Level Champion for Climate Action, Laurence Tubiana, CEO, European Climate Foundation, Dr. Pasang Dolma Sherpa, Executive Director, Center for Indigenous Peoples Research and Development, Hita Lakani Yongo, the official youth constituency of the UNFCCC. Thank you very much and welcome to you all. While you take your seats, let me tell you and the audience about the 3 questions that we're going to be exploring. So we're going to have a panel discussion now divided into 3 themes, 3 topics. The first round of questions will be around what have we learned so far about the recent IPCC report and its implications? What is needed from climate action and ambition in the coming years to respond to the report and keep 1.5 degrees within reach? And what do we need to see from the UNFCCC process and COP26 outcome to make those things happen? So those are the 3 key themes we're going to be exploring. Welcome to you all. And just by way of further introduction, I'm going to go down the line, perhaps starting with Henry Puna first, to just introduce yourself. And I'm just going to ask each of the panelists to give a 30-second introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, moderator. Greetings, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Henry Puna. For 10 years, until last September, I was the Prime Minister of the Cook Islands and had the pleasure and honor of introducing some global measures to preserve our environment, including the declaration of our whole EEZ of nearly 2 million square kilometers as a marine protected area. So happy to be here today.
Thank you very much for that. And then Gonzalo Munoz, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks so much. Gonzalo Munoz, United Nations High-Level Climate Action Champion, designated by the Chilean COP25 presidency.
Thank you very much. Laurence Tubiana?
So, I'm Laurence Tubiana. I'm the CEO of the European Climate Foundation, and I was previously the special representative of the COP21 in Paris.
And Dr. Pasang Dolma Sherpa?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pasang Dolma Sherpa. I am here from Center for Indigenous People Research and Development based in Kathmandu. I'm the founder, co-chair of local communities of an indigenous people platform of UNCCC, and also the present member of the FWG of the platform. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And at the other end there, Hita Lakhani.
Hi everyone, I'm Hita Lakhani. I'm from India and I'm the current global focal point of YOUNGO, which is the official mandated mechanism for engagement of children and youth and the UNFCCC. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let's consider our first question. So what have we learned so far about the recent IPCC report and its implications? Henry Puna, perhaps you'd like to reflect on that.
Thank you. Thank you. The latest IPCC report confirms what the Blue Pacific already knows to be true, that our planet is in the throes of a human-induced climate crisis, and we've lost the luxury of time. Right now, with 1.1 degrees of warming, our oceans are warming, our seas are rising, and our crops are being damaged by saltwater intrusion. In the last 5 years alone, 5 Category 5 tropical cyclones have wreaked havoc in the Blue Pacific, with economic costs of losses up to 63% of GDP. And while the climate change crisis is here and now, it's going to get much worse if we don't change course. The IPCC report shows that on current trajectory, we are headed to 1.5 degrees before 2040 and a catastrophic 4.4 degrees by 2100. And of major concern for our Blue Pacific continent is the reality that on current projections, sea levels could rise by 2 meters by 2100 and a disastrous and unthinkable 5 meters by 2150. This will obviously result in the loss of whole island countries and of millions of lives, homes and livelihoods, not just in the Pacific, but indeed across the whole world. Holding to 1.5 degrees is therefore absolutely critical to the future of our Blue Pacific and our blue planet to avoid the worst of climate change impacts. Every extra bit of warming matters for our future and for our survival.
Thank you very much, Henry. Thank you very much, Henry Puna. And the IPCC report, as you probably all know, has a lot of information about regional variations. So the Blue Pacific, as we've heard, is already experiencing some of those dire warnings. I'd like to go on to Gonzalo Munoz. We heard Henry Puna talking about the reality of some of these predictions. What's your takeaway to the IPCC report, and what do you think the implications are?
Well, thanks so much, Anya. And I would like to reflect in a kind of different way from the report. On one side, because my role is to bring the non-state actors into the conversation, but also because I think there's an element that we might want to take into consideration, and it's related to when the report was released. The report was released in the middle of the pandemic. We have been going through at least 2 years where science has been strengthened all around the world. We have seen the importance of leaders to follow science, and we have seen the failures of leaders that do not follow science. So that context means a lot, but also nature. Do you remember the events that we had in that, around that month of the few weeks? So it was like a Hollywood script. Like if someone was deciding to, okay, we will send the report because this species requires some PowerPoint, some sheets and data and numbers, but we will send very strong evidence of what we're talking about. Evidence of suffering, evidence of nature destroyment, evidence of economic destroyment. So we have seen, I think that when it comes to what I represent in terms of the non-party stakeholders, honestly, it's not bringing much more than what we had already from October 2018. It's a confirmation when it comes to the trajectory. Of course, the importance of understanding that the window is getting narrower, but mostly there's some element there, and I don't know who was preparing it, if maybe someone, whether it's a collective intelligence or some very strategic marketing for scientists. There is an opportunity for communicating in a stronger way, and that's something that all of us as the climate community can support on helping scientists to bring the knowledge in a way that will be more digestible for the communities that we all are serving. At the end, I think that it was extremely helpful to show to the world the level of risk that we are confronting in all particular levels. It's not just for scientists, it's not just for environmentalists or for politicians, maybe, if someone was thinking that the 1.5 degree report back in 2018 was about that. Now it's about the whole of the society. And I think that that element, it's a communicational element, it's an evidence element, is extremely important now because it has allowed non-party stakeholders to say, okay, we got it.
Can I just come back to you very briefly? So the message is very clear. I'm quite interested in what you say about communicating in a stronger way. I mean, it's already pretty strong, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's like we have had a lot of evidence. I mean, probably all of us were on a certain moment moved by the inconvenient truth. Probably all of us have seen Sir David Attenborough's films, and we have heard the expression of the people in the streets, starting with the youth, right? I mean, in terms of ways to interact with the message, we've had a lot. Honestly, I think that we're not that intelligent as a species. Yeah? And therefore, what we're seeing is new elements joining and reinforcing the message in a way that now is shaking us by combining different elements. That's what I'm referring to. The report, of course, holds the truth and the strength of science, but in a moment, during a pandemic, but in a moment that combined elements even outside of the report that made the message even stronger.
Thank you very much, Mr. Munoz. Laurence Toubiana, what are your reflections regarding the IPCC report and its meaning and its implications?
I think Gonzalo has said very important element on how the evidence presented by IPCC has somehow slowly but really penetrated not only government mindset, but really the whole societies now. And that, for me, a very important element that young people outside in the street, all over even with, of course, this COVID interruption, and the citizen at large are now understanding that 1.5 does make a difference vis-à-vis what was in a way the consensus. And when we look back to Kyoto Protocol and all the scopes, you see that this is changing the perception. And it's so important that something which was a sort of a political signal in the Paris Agreement, negotiated at the last minute of the last day, is now something that is a solid reference that has to move the center of gravity of our discussion, and in particular, the consistency of the plan, the contribution, and the long-term strategy. But that, IPCC, and I will not repeat all the elements excellently presented by the Patrick Valence and the report. So, but things that every time we try to forget climate impacts, the IPCC report is there to remind us we cannot ignore the reality. Because of course we would like to forget that. It's just so difficult and so threatening that, our mental space, and it has been really demonstrated by many, many social psychologists, we try our best to just forget it. And IPCC is coming back each time to say you can't. You can't ignore that climate change is not, you cannot ignore it. So that is important, and in a way, the way IPCC just, in a way, distribute its knowledge is very, very timely, and I think it has grown into the communication capacity of the scientific body. I do think that still we have to convince at one point that there is no other option, even if it's looked really difficult to attain the 1.5 degrees. So that's why when we will discuss on the process, we should not forget that we are not talking about a political thing, but a dire reality. I do think that more often, very often, the more richer countries, and in particular embedded in the G20, think that climate, extreme weather, and damages is for others, but it's not true. It's for them as well. And there is an excellent report published by an Italian Center of Research, the CMCC, that just show that for G20, the price tag is even much higher than for anybody else. So this sort of cognitive dissonance, which is something IPCC is really working on, is worth reminding, and that's very important as the youth movement is, one, saying 1.5, we have to keep it alive, and second, that government, you have to respect the Paris goal you have signed for. And in a way, they are calling for reality. So I think this combination of the citizen and the science make possible, in my view, to help government deliver what they have to deliver.
Thank you very much, Laurence Toubiana. And Pasang Dolma Sherpa, what are your views about the report?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Anna. I think the report is, as my colleague already said, like you know, despite the COVID, the factors of the COVID, it came up, you know, with the situation, how the climate is upcoming. So the importance of keeping the 1.5. In overall, the report actually does not provide the additional kind of different information as business as other reports. It has continued emphasizing that you know, about the past climate and also about the future climate scenario, which is more you know, more challenging ahead. And the report also continuously providing that how the climate is, you know, the changing and increasing this permafrost, snow, glaciers, and that not only actually presented by the report, but also we have already experiencing. I'm from Nepal, from the Mountain Everest regions. The white mountains is now turning into black mountains. The highest peak on earth is turning into black. So perhaps you know, this is already indicators presented by the IPCC report that climate change is really speedily happening now, and the action must be taken as, you know, as soon as possible. And the temperatures below 1.5 degree is not that difficult. It's still possible if we really come together and collectively take the actions on the floor. The assessment report 6 actually also incorporated the diverse knowledge system, which is a good part. It also presents the values and beliefs and interests of different groups, which is also welcoming to be incorporated. However, from the indigenous people perspective, if I see here in this assessment report, 6th assessment report of the IPCC, that indigenous peoples kept on presenting as a vulnerable community, which is true in a way. But at the same time, indigenous peoples have also solution, and unfortunately that has not covered by IPCC report. And so this is very, and then, and also, you know, like the summary for the policymakers and documents most widely disseminated and reviewed by those taken by relevant decision makers at the national and international level does not even mention about indigenous peoples, which is unfortunate for all of us. and neither local communities or human rights or indigenous people's rights. So, reflecting these reports is assessment report 6, radio silence, other knowledge systems, especially indigenous peoples and local community knowledge system, that really contributed a huge for climate change resilience.
Thank you very much, and I'll come back to you in our second round of questions to explore that a bit further. And finally, Hita Lakhani, what's your reaction to the report?
Thank you so much. I won't go into details of the science already mentioned and very elaboratively explained about what the implications are. I think what we do need to realize is that the science is absolutely, absolutely clear. We really do not have any time to lose. What we thought would happen by the end of the mid of the decade is happening now, and it's happening a lot more sooner. So the recent report basically just highlights everything that we're talking about, everything that we've been saying for years. The science was clear even back in the 1970s. We knew that we're creating greenhouse gas emissions. We knew that we're creating climate change. What this report is actually basically specifying is just getting into more details. It's getting into nuances and telling us that it is much worse than we thought it is. So I think the implications of the report and the implications of what the science is very, very well thought out, is very well and clearly stated now. And what we really need to do is use this knowledge, use this science, and just act upon it, get together as a global community and really, make our mark. And either this is we move towards a side where we really go and we do what we have to do to save our humanity, to save our species, or we can choose to live in the short term and then forget about the humanity, forget about humankind in general.
Thank you very much, Hita. So use this knowledge. So what's needed from climate action and ambition in the coming years to respond to the report? Henry Puna, perhaps you'd like to comment.
What is needed now is for governments, big businesses, the major emitters of the world, to no longer ignore the voices of those already enduring this unfolding existential threat. And indeed, they cannot any longer ignore the voices, the resounding voices of our young people who have shown their real interest in what's happening here this week. There are simply no more excuses to be had. Our actions today will have consequences now and into the future for all of us to bear. Fundamentally, ladies and gentlemen, we need to see rapid emissions reductions over the next decade and then net zero by 2050 to keep 1.5 degrees within reach. We need leadership by all countries, but particularly by the G20, which accounts for over 75% of global emissions. We need strong commitments backed by urgent and real action, including predictable, accessible, timely, and sustainable financial resources. We welcome the discussions on loss and damage, but urge practical solutions as the climate change impacts on the Pacific and other developing countries are exceeding adaptation measures with every extra bit of warming. Let me briefly emphasize the climate change actions that our leaders are taking in the Pacific. We're not just being on the front line of climate change complaining or sitting back and doing nothing. We are doing what we can. In 2019, our leaders issued the Kainakilua Declaration, which continues as our clarion call for urgent climate change action now. And in August this year, our leaders issued a groundbreaking declaration on preserving maritime zones in the face of climate change-related sea level rise. They've also endorsed the establishment of the Pacific Resilience Facility to assist vulnerable communities in the Pacific to build their resilience. We call on all our international partners to help support the efforts of our Blue Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lawrence Tubiana, you were the architect of the Paris Agreement. I'm sure much of the audience knows this already. We've seen a raft of announcements on forests, on methane and coal. It's very encouraging. But what do we need from COP in relation to nationally determined contributions and also long-term strategies?
Absolutely. There was, of course, very positive announcement, and Gonzalo will, of course, speak much better than me on that. But of course, we need this to be implemented and connected with what finally we have in the process, which are the national determined contribution. And you know, in Paris, every country agrees to update and increase regularly, and in particular in 2020-21 in Glasgow, this contribution. And still there is, of course, we can recognize there is a disconnect on what is pledged, and in particular on the long-term strategy, which again is very interesting. There are more than 130 countries that have committed to net zero by 2050 or around that date. But they are not for the moment substantiated in very few cases by clear plans that we can see in particular that in the next decade we really are reducing emission. IPCC report is unfortunately very clear. We have to halve, or at least to diminish, to reduce emission by 45% by 2030. And this is what is consistent with more or less, not totally, with 1.5 as a stabilization level of temperature. So, and this is upgrading, and we don't have them, we have to recognize that we don't have them today in Glasgow. So and I know many countries, in particular the more vulnerable countries and the High Ambition Coalition, have spoken about, so okay, we are not there, there was a COVID crisis and many other political factors, but we need to really come to the table at the latest next year with the ones that are in line with the 1.5 target. So I think that's the more urgent thing. Then second, it's important to link this net zero with 2030 and to now have, which will be an improvement in the process, to have the long-term strategies connected to the 2030 goal and consistent with 1.5. So it's a massive effort, I recognize that. And in addition, I think that's why we need to carefully look at the integrity of the carbon market, which of course very important to have them to flow, of course, resources to developing countries in particular to protect the forest, to restore nature. But then we need absolutely to consider that it's a marginal solution for the target we have to, which is really reducing effectively emission everywhere. So that's my concern, but my hope as well. We have now a clear path to match these divergences between what IPCC is saying and the political instrument, the legal instrument we have in our hand.
Thank you very much. And Gonzalo Munoz, I'd like you to respond to that, but also last week there was a report which said that emissions commitments made so far, if delivered, would close 9 gigatons of the 22 gigaton gap, and also businesses which create a lot of those emissions, how do we get them to close that gap? How do we measure them?
Well, Ania, I think that one of the elements that is most important on this, and Laurence brought it beautifully, is about the integrity and the credibility of those commitments, okay? We, of course, are celebrating the intensity of those commitments, really well packed in what has been an amazing COP26 in that sense. Now it's all about delivering. And me representing the non-party stakeholders are putting a lot of tension on what this means in terms of a cultural shift for those non-state actors. And in that sense, we need to help them develop the right type of governance mechanism. This will require a very rapid change on how decisions are being made. This will require integration of science into the boardroom. This will require also bringing some other elements into the boardroom, meaning, of course, not only bringing nature or science itself, but also, of course, and being today in the Gender Day, it will require also at least gender parity. But then what we require is to bring all of this inspiration and those voluntary mechanisms and allow this to become regulated, right? So that's at the end what we expect. So in that sense, we expect that we can even, as Laurence was referring to, we can use the capacity of non-state actors to report in a much more regular basis, to inspire also the system itself to be much more focused on how do we manage the very short term. So I would say at least annually, as it's in the mechanisms of both Race to Zero and Race to Resilience. We, of course, need to see how of this momentum that is being built is now helping to reorientate all of the global efforts in pursuit of the limit warming of to 1.5 degrees. And we do expect with my dear friend and brother, we're partners in Climb with Nigel, we have proposed that both campaigns, Race to Zero and Race to Resilience, they get very well connected, or we will offer mechanisms for connecting it to the global stocktake. So we have a very short period of time in which we have to advance and scale with not only the commitments, but the real implementation of those technologies and practices. Second, make those real changes in the culture of how those non-state actors organizations are being held and how the decisions are being made there. Then report in a very regular basis, always with science in the center, and then hopefully that will allow the parties to take what can be useful for that to be integrated into a global stocktake.
Thank you very much, sort of strengthening and speeding up that global stocktake. Pasang Dolma Sherpa, you said in your first answer that the voice of Indigenous people is not being heeded in the IPCC report. So I'd be interested to know how Indigenous people could contribute to the solutions that we need for climate action.
It has been almost a week since we have been here in Glasgow, and that we have been trying our best to raise our voice and transfer our knowledge system and also our contribution to be heard by the parties and also the other bodies here in Glasgow, that how Indigenous people contributed for climate change resilience on the ground. The different study, including the the IPCC and even the IUCN and World Bank, and there are different bodies already come up with the fact that less than 5.7% of Indigenous people around the world contributing, safeguarding 80% of the biodiversity and ecosystem. This fact is already cleared, the role and contribution of Indigenous peoples. And now we are here digging out as if the nature-based solution is somewhere flying. In fact, the nature-based solution is the basic principles of Indigenous people. It's a symbiotic relation with the nature and ecosystem is part of our life. So instead of the principle of etik and emic really reminds me that instead of digging out what values and knowledge system we have already at home in the community that contributed for climate change resilience, we always seek the solution outside. So, I'm also a member of the platform of one of the constituent bodies of the UNCCC. The purpose of the three platforms knowledge and capacity building, climate change policy and action, in representing the 7 socio-cultural regions of Indigenous people, we have been putting all our efforts how Indigenous people knowledge system should be on the same table as the science knowledge and to be dealt together rather separately, rather enforcing the hierarchy between different types of knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is validated only when it fits to the science knowledge. This notion should be changed, because the holistic approach comes only if we really balance our knowledge system with the Indigenous knowledge system. And we should also take the paradigm shift that Indigenous knowledge system, Indigenous peoples are not subject of the research, but they are the part of the research, they are the contributors, and this should be respected by the IPCC and also the policies in the discourse of climate change.
Thank you very much. And the point there that Indigenous people are stewards of 80% of biodiversity and should be taken seriously. So finally, Hitha Lakhani, how much faith do you have in the COP negotiations actually heeding this science?
Well, I've seen how we've been changing. My first COP was in 2015 in Paris, and for me, it was overwhelming and extremely lost. I was lost, which is usual for someone who's coming to their first COP. But I think I've seen how the conversations are changing, and it was extremely inspiring for me to see at the closing at the SBI and the Substar on Saturday evening, there was only mentions of 1.5. We've completely disregarded 2, and this is exactly how it should be. We cannot live in a world which is 2 degrees warmer. There are countries which will not be there when it's a 2 degrees warmer world. Cities which will not exist, future generations which will not have countries, nations, cultures to grow up in. So we cannot talk about a 2 degree warmer world anymore. We really have to talk about 1.5 and not exceeding 1.5 by a margin at all. So I think this in itself, looking at how the conversation has gone in the first week, looks like we're on the right track. But we're still only in the midst of the second week, and there are 3.5 more days to see how this actually turns out. And at the end of it, we're still looking at the nationally determined contributions. We're looking at the ambition. We need finance to ensure that we're at 1.5. So it's not just the 3 days of COP that are ahead of us, but it's also looking at how do countries come together as a global community. Are we really walking the talk? All the pledges that were made at the World Leaders Summit, even the $100 billion finance goal is nowhere close to completion, is nowhere even close to coming together. So without finance, there's no way you can ask a country to adapt to climate change. There's no way you can ask a country to deal with loss and damage. There's no way you can ask them to even work towards finding mitigation solutions. So it's a holistic problem, and while the negotiations are progressing, while it has been something that I think is on a positive note, at least by the end of week 1, despite it being 1 a.m., I think this was a positive ending for week 1. There is a lot that we do need to do. There is a lot of work that we need to work together and really, truly walk the talk and really talk about 1.5, really achieve 1.5 and not higher. And 1.5 is already the bare minimum. We shouldn't be talking about a warmer world. We should have dealt with this crisis 20 years ago. So talking about 1.5, achieving 1.5 is not an achievement. It is the bare minimum that we can do for ourselves and for generations to come.
You've very eloquently previewed what we're going to be talking about in the next session. So in the next section, which is about what's needed from the COP26 process and what's needed from the outcome, you said what you need. Do you want to just go a little bit further as to what you would actually like to see? What can you dream of? What kind of agreement would you imagine?
Well, if I had the chance and if I could dream, I think I would dream a lot of different things. As Yango, we've been working for the past 2 years with the Alliance of Small Island States and with March for Science on a Science Not Silence campaign, as you see on my T-shirt. And we've been working to get countries to publicly champion the IPCC 1.5 degree special report that came out in 2018. And this was because we were in the negotiation rooms. I was in the rooms back in 2018, 2019, observing, and we saw how the science was disregarded, how countries were blocking the science in simple wordings of whether you welcome or not, and so and so for the IPCC 1.5 degrees report. And it really got postponed by years and years, just acknowledging the necessity of 1.5, acknowledging the language of having 1.5 in the text. So if I could, I would want to see countries publicly championing 1.5, publicly going out and saying, we're going to do everything that we can in our capacity to ensure that our goals are in line with the global 1.5 degrees emission rise, but we're also going to work towards ensuring that we're not just talking, we're actually putting into action. When you look at the NDC synthesis report, you see that we're nowhere close to 1.5 even today. We're not even on the track to 1.5. We're way off to 3 and maybe 3.7 and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of work that we do need. And like I said also just previously, we really need, if I could, I would really want countries to sign up to this Science Not Silence or to talk about the 1.5, to be a part of the solution, work with young people, work with indigenous communities, work with people who are really championing this from the bottom up, and take this as part of the solution by the end of COP.
Thank you very much. Laurence Toubiana, of course, you will know that many of these agreements are often made at the 11th hour. And Paris Agreement was made with Article 6 still unresolved. You've already said that carbon markets need to be there needs to be more integrity of carbon markets. Do you think we can actually reach 1.5 degrees without Article 6?
I do think we need, of course, all instruments. But at the same time, when I look at many net zero announcements, or when they are more or less described, there is a lot, of course, of ideas that we can fill them with carbon offsets. And of course, referring to what the carbon markets can offer. So that's the concern. I think we need this carbon market. We need the flow of resources to reach to the one who needs them, which is really important. But I think we can put in place the rules for that. We don't need to have enormous, intermediaries that finally will capture that rent where in reality we need this to reach to the people who are really protecting the natural resources. In particular, there is other, of course, elements in the carbon market. I do think that it's really important to consider the role of the indigenous communities in the way this is approached. And I think that we see too many cases where this concern and contribution is discarded. So that's important. I would like to see somewhere in the text that we really think that on the forest element, we really are serious about having, of course, a contribution and the knowledge and the participation of the indigenous communities. So we need to restore nature. We need to protect carbon sinks, including the oceans. But I think we have to look at the perspective that this is an intermediary path to net zero and zero emission. And in my view, that where at least what we can get this is really strong, avoiding the double counting absolutely, securing the integrity of the process, make sure that the resources get to the right people, and really effectively understand that this has to become redundant as we look to secure 1.5. So it is about transparency as well. As Gonzalo said, everything these days is about that. And it's good because we need trust. And there are, of course, in the Article 6 as well, the non-market cooperation element. So, and you see, I know that there is, of course, a very hot issue about the share of proceeds, where these resources could go, and we may know maybe a little bit more generous approach to that. So it's not a miracle solution. It has to be really with a lot of integrity, and I see progress these days, and it has to, the money has to reach to the right people, and indigenous people are very, very concerned about that.
Thank you very much. Henry Puna, what would you wish for from the COP26 outcome?
What would I wish for? Everything. But for the Pacific, we see this COP26 as a critical opportunity to turn this climate change crisis around. It is an opportunity to listen to the resounding calls of citizens from across our blue planet for ambitious climate change action. It is also an opportunity to shape a future that is resilient and sustainable for our children and for future generations. COP26 must welcome, adopt, and action the IPCC report and ensure the 1.5 degrees is front and center of the COP26 decisions. In the medium to long term, all countries must commit to stronger 2030 climate targets and net zero emissions by 2050 if we are to hold our world to 1.5 degrees. And for the future of our blue Pacific, COP26 must integrate the oceans into the UNFCCC process. We know there have been arduous negotiations so far at this COP. While there has been progress, we are not there yet. What we need is stronger action, and we need it in the next few days. Put simply, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot understate the urgency of what we must achieve here at COP26. Climate change is no longer an issue for debate. The science is very clear and unequivocal. It is a matter of survival. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pasang Dolma Sherpa, what would you wish for?
Yeah, as my brother said earlier, I wish for a lot of things here. Yeah, the most important part here is like, the history of this UNFCCC already shows in the absence of right-based climate solution, nothing will be possible, especially to meet the 1.5 degree. So I really wish that our, science bodies, different bodies, in fact, within the UNFCCC and outside the bodies also, and as well as the state parties, to understand that the role and contribution of indigenous people be acknowledged as a basis for meeting the 1.5 degrees centigrade, and as well as for the future solution, and pass the knowledge to our next generation. And then and another part is like, I just would like to highlight the wishes, not only my wishes, but the wishes of indigenous peoples, the indigenous knowledge holders who travel all the way from different part of the world. 24 knowledge holders who left today were here for a few days here, and we joined together, we come up together and exchange our knowledge and come to the suggestion to be acknowledged, addressed, recognized, actually passed by the COP26 is like the wish is right-based solution of the climate change. And especially the indigenous peoples led research-based solutions and also own understanding, values, science, knowledge, rights, and realities should be respected by outside scientists and other researchers and UN bodies and equal footing and on the equal rank rather on the other way around. So I really wish that right-based modalities of climate change solution is the basis. And finally, I would like to also read the one very small short press statement of Rights Resource Initiative for the COP26, and that turns out to be my wishes also. The failure to recognize the collective rights, land rights of indigenous people potentially risks the equivalent up to 15 times of world's 2020 energy-related carbon dioxide emission. Therefore, respect for and enhancement of indigenous peoples and local community rights remain critical for supporting the continued stewardship of landscape and biodiversity therein.
And thank you very much. And that just leads me to ask Gonzalo Munoz, what would you wish for? And also, you mentioned the reporting process there, the global stocktake. Should that be yearly? The next one is in 2023. Should the next one be in 2022?
Well, thank you, Anya. I would like to, definitely. But I'm not the one to be promoting any type of a decision being made by the parties. When it comes to my, what I think that are the ideal outcomes, first, there's one concept that is important, is our capacity of delivering on the promises of the past. I think that COP26 is here to recover a lot of and restore trust in the multilateralism. And we need that. We know we need it. We know how important it is that having gone through the crisis on the pandemic, and I do expect, of course, I'm speaking also on behalf of many non-party stakeholders that do expect that the multilateralism is restored at its maximum capacity, and probably as we saw in Paris. Therefore, the bar is there high, and we do expect that that will be one of the outcomes. Then, of course, there's another element that is a sense of urgency around the solidarity to all of those that are suffering, the consequences. I think that that's also a big element that in some cases takes us to also the relationship with the vaccines and the relationship with the $100 billion. And again, some of them are related to promises of the past, but the importance of going, leaving the room from Glasgow knowing that we did the maximum effort on really solving the urgent needs of those that are mostly suffering. Then I would say, I think that we have a real possibility of COP26 to be the first COP around action and implementation, both in mitigation and adaptation and resilience. Everything that we've seen in terms of commitments and big numbers, if they are set on credible criteria, if they are set on with science in the center, then it might, and I would say should and will show a possibility of moving all of the process towards the implementation that we require. But finally, I think that COP26 has the real capacity of allowing the conditions for those trillions of dollars to start flowing fast and absolutely, again, based in science.
Thank you very much. And I think you summarize what all the speakers have said about the need for everybody to observe the science and to press the fact that 1.5 is the only option. We heard about the need for indigenous people to have their land rights and human rights preserved in any agreement. And we heard from the Blue Pacific about the various steps that they are taking to build resilience, their maritime zones, their Kanaki Declaration, and the need for extra funds for adaptation. And we also heard about the fact that we need long-term strategies linked to 2030 growth. And the integrity of the carbon market to be strengthened. And we heard the very important call for science to be in the boardroom as well. So I'd like to thank all our speakers for your really insightful comments, your inspiring comments, and your challenges, really, to the negotiators at COP26. Thank you all very much. And with that, I would like to invite the COP President, Alok Sharma, to come up and make some final closing words. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that, and good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to join you. And look, I mean, I think as I heard this discussion continuing, we all know that 1.5 is much more than a number. And I think you've heard here from the panelists today, you've heard throughout this event itself, and I think it was summed up, actually, by Prime Minister Mia Mottley at the World Leaders Summit some days ago. And you know, this is what she said it means for Barbados and indeed other island states around the world. She said 1.5 is what we need to survive. 2 degrees is a death sentence. Now, as these negotiations come to a head, one of the things that I hope all negotiators and ministers will think about is what it means in terms of a rising temperature for millions and millions of people around the world. And you will all have seen the IPCC report that came out in August. I think it was pretty sobering. I think it was very much a wake-up call. I think it's been called Code Red for Humanity by the Secretary General. And it just demonstrates that actually the window to keep 1.5 within reach is closing. And it's down to us. It's down to human activity. That's what's causing global warming. And if I can just give you 2 examples of what it means, the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. At 1.5 degrees, if we get there, it means an extra 700 million people across the world facing extreme heat. At 2 degrees, we're talking about 2 billion extra. At 1.5 degrees, 70% of the coral reefs around the world are gone. At 2 degrees, they're all gone. So I think as we think about these issues, it's going to be very important for negotiators, for all of those involved in this process, to think about the real-world impact of the decisions that we make here, the real-world impact of the text that we agree in terms of what it means for people in our world. And having said all of that, look, the reality is that future isn't yet written, right? We know that we can still work to keep that 1.5 degree limit alive. And this is where I think we must allow science to light the way. Without it, quite frankly, we are stumbling in the dark. I know Sir Patrick has spoken about all this today, and you know, he's pointed out why science has been at the heart of our COP presidency over the past couple of years, and it will continue to be at the heart of our presidency in our presidency year as well. And it's why in all my discussions when I've been around the world, when I've talked to leaders, to ministers, I've said, please, let's follow the facts. Be guided by the science when you make your national commitments, when you take national action, and as you negotiate at COP26. Now, that, as I said, is the focus of the negotiated outcome and how we can keep the 1.5 degree limit alive. You know that we're also trying very hard to finalize the Paris rulebook so that we can, if I can put it like this, unleash the full force of the Paris Agreement. And the reality is, and you heard this from world leaders just last week, they all stood up, 120 of them came here, they all stood up, and they talked about the fact that we need to agree an outcome that launches a decade of ever-increasing ambition. Now, there are many proposals as to how we might achieve that, and I know that you know, you've had a very productive discussion today on what the COP outcome needs to be to deliver for 1.5. And I can say to you that over the past week, we have made progress in the negotiations, but we are at that point where the rubber hits the road, and we still have a long way to go over these next few days, and you know, there is still a big mountain to climb. We're going to find consensus and reach agreement. So my message to you, I mean, you already know this since you're sitting here as part of this discussion, but my message to the negotiators and the ministers is follow the science and actually listen and reflect to what people in this room have said today as well. And of course, we need to work together to translate the efforts of academics into an ambitious COP26 outcome and a decade of action. And ultimately, we need to let science lead the way. So thank you so much for taking part in this event, for listening to me, and I'm counting on all of you with your various influences to ensure that your countries, your ministers, your negotiators are now going to aim for ambition at COP26. Thank you.